The morning air hung thick with gunpowder smoke and the acrid stench of burned timber when 8-year-old Evangeline Reed stepped from their cabin door. 3 miles south, the Henderson homestead was nothing but blackened ruins and rising smoke columns, the screams of horses and humans having finally fallen silent with the dawn. She clutched her tin cup against her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run back inside where Papa cleaned his rifle with shaking hands, and Nathan paced like a caged wolf. But something had caught her eye by the stone well, something dark spreading through the yellowed grass like spilled ink, blood. Fresh and still warm, creating a crimson trail that led her horrified gaze to a figure collapsed in the shadow of the wellhead. A Cheyenne warrior lay crumpled there, his magnificent war paint streaked with dust and agony, eagle feathers matted with his own life's fluid. The gaping wound in his side pulsed with each labored breath, soaking his beaded vest in dark red. Evangeline's cup clattered to the stones as terror and compassion warred in her young heart. Every lesson her father had drilled into her mind screamed the same warning: done. Hide. These were the savages who scalped children, who burned families alive for sport. The very sight of war paint should send her fleeing in panic. But when the warrior's eyes fluttered open dark as winter storms and filled with pain that transcended any boundary of race or hatred, she saw not the monster from her nightmares, but simply a man dying alone and far from his people. Water. He gasped in broken English, the words scraping from his throat like sandpaper on raw wood. Her small hand moved before her mind could interfere, retrieving the fallen cup, even as her father's voice began shouting from the cabin. She could feel the weight of frontier wisdom, generations of survival instinct, all telling her to run. Yet something deeper than fear, something that recognized suffering regardless of its source, guided her trembling fingers as she dipped the cup into the well's cool depths. The warrior looked at her with such desperate, grateful humanity that her heart nearly shattered. As she knelt beside him, acutely aware of the tomahawk at his belt and the scalping knife at his thigh, she found herself trembling not with terror, but with an overwhelming need to ease another being's agony. Evangeline. Jeremiah Reed's voice boomed across the yard like thunder from heaven's own artillery. Get away from there this instant. But she had already lowered the cup to the stranger's cracked lips, watching him drink with the desperate relief of a soul being pulled back from death's very threshold. As the last drops touched his tongue, his blood-stained hand closed gently around her tiny wrist, not threatening, but reverent as a prayer of thanksgiving. Little water giver. He whispered, his eyes holding hers with startling intensity despite his obvious agony. My people will remember this kindness forever. Jeremiah thundered across the yard, his Spencer rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands that shook with raw terror and barely controlled rage. At 43 years of frontier hardship had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his beard prematurely gray. The morning's distant sounds of massacre had already frayed his nerves to breaking point, and finding his daughter ministering to a wounded Cheyenne warrior had pushed him completely beyond rational thought. Evangeline stepped back from that savage this instant. His voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. That's Ironhawk himself, the butcher who just finished slaughtering the Henderson family. He was dying, Papa. He just needed water to live. Or he's a killer. Jeremiah aimed his rifle directly at the warrior's head, though his hands trembled with barely suppressed panic and generations of ingrained hatred. Look at that war paint. He probably still has innocent blood under his fingernails from this morning's butchery. Ironhawk struggled to push himself upright, despite the crimson trickling steadily from the corner of his mouth. Not your enemy, he managed, pressing his palm against his chest with obvious effort. Ironhawk does not make war on children or water givers. The hell you don't, you lying savage. Jeremiah's finger tightened dangerously on the trigger. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't end this right here and save the territory some grief. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats made them all freeze in place like statues. A dozen Cheyenne warriors crested the eastern ridge at full gallop, their war cries splitting the morning air with primitive fury, and their weapons raised for immediate violence. Jeremiah's blood turned to ice water as he counted the painted faces, the gleaming tomahawks, the obvious intent for retribution. "Papa, don't shoot." Evangeline pleaded desperately, still kneeling beside Ironhawk, despite her father's frantic gestures for her to flee. "Please don't make this any worse than it has to be." The warriors formed their traditional circle around the cabin, their ponies snorting and stamping with battle fever, while their riders sat motionless as carved stone. Their leader, a younger man with an impressive headdress of eagle feathers, dismounted with fluid grace and spoke rapidly in the musical cadences of Cheyenne. Ironhawk replied in the same tongue, his voice gaining unexpected strength despite his terrible wounds. He tells them, Ironhawk translated slowly for the terrified white family, that the small white child gave sacred water from the spring of our ancestors. Sacred. Jeremiah kept his rifle trained steadily on the chief's chest, though sweat beaded his forehead as he calculated impossible odds. "This is our land bought and paid for. We have legal papers from the territorial office." Ironhawk's bitter laugh cut him off like a knife blade. "Your white man's papers cannot sell what belongs to the spirits of the earth, to the bones of our grandfathers sleeping beneath this grass." The young war leader helped Ironhawk struggle to his feet, supporting his uncle's weight while blood continued seeping through crude bandages. "My nephew, Running Bear," Ironhawk said with visible effort. "He speaks your strange tongue better than his old uncle." Running Bear stepped forward with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his English crisp and precise, despite the hostility radiating from his entire posture. "You permitted white child to give life water to dying chief. This makes you different from other whites we have known. We're not different from anybody." Jeremiah snapped, his voice tight with fear and the desperate need to maintain some dignity in the face of overwhelming force. "We're just trying to survive out here, same as everybody else in this godforsaken territory." Survival. Ironhawk nodded thoughtfully, as if tasting the word and finding it familiar on his tongue. "Yes, we know much about survival, about what it costs to draw another breath in a world gone mad with killing." He looked down at Evangeline, who still clutched her empty cup like a sacred talisman. But this child has pure spirit inside her small body. She sees person in need, not enemy to fear. She's only 8 years old. Jeremiah protested desperately. "She doesn't understand the harsh realities of frontier life, the dangers. She understands what you have forgotten in your fear." Ironhawk interrupted his gaze, returning to the older man with something that might have been pity. "That water is life itself. That mercy given freely." He paused, pressing a trembling hand against his wounded side. "That mercy can sometimes prove stronger than generations of hate." Running Bear helped his uncle toward the waiting horses, but Ironhawk stopped before mounting and turned back to face the white family with ceremonial gravity. "Little water giver," he called softly to Evangeline. "Your kindness will echo through many seasons like thunder in the mountains. When great darkness comes to threaten your family, remember this moment of grace." What darkness?" Jeremiah demanded, his rifle still following the chief's movements. "What kind of threat are you talking about?" "The darkness that follows men like Cole Blackwood wherever they ride." Ironhawk said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "He brings death to all who cross his path, leaves only ash and bones in his wake. But you..." He looked meaningfully at Evangeline with something approaching reverence. "You have given sacred water from sacred ground to one who will not forget. You are marked now as protected ones." The warriors swung onto their ponies with effortless grace, Ironhawk swaying dangerously in his saddle. but remaining upright through sheer force of will and tribal pride. He raised one blood-stained hand in what might have been blessing or warning, impossible to tell which. Sacred water from sacred spring. He called back as dust began to swirl around the departing war party. The spirits have taken notice of the small water giver. As the thunder of hoofbeats faded into distance and silence settled over the homestead like a burial shroud, 16-year-old Nathan Reed emerged from the cabin, where he'd been watching through windows with his own rifle at ready. Tall and gangly with his deceased mother's serious dark eyes, he moved with the awkward energy of recent growth spurts that had left him all elbows and knees. "Pa, who was that really?" he asked, studying the blood-stained ground by the well with obvious fascination. "I mean, was that actually Ironhawk himself?" "Trouble," Jeremiah said simply, his voice hollow with exhaustion and growing dread. "More trouble than any of us can handle if it decides to come calling again." "But he said we were protected now," Evangeline pointed out with the unshakable logic of childhood innocence. "Because I gave him water from the sacred spring that used to belong to his people." Nathan snorted with adolescent skepticism. "There's nothing sacred about our well, Evangeline. We dug it ourselves with our own hands just 2 summers back, remember? Maybe we were wrong about what we were digging into," Jeremiah murmured almost to himself, staring at the exact spot where Ironhawk had lain dying moments before. Something about the chief's absolute certainty unsettled him far more deeply than he cared to admit, as if the man possessed prophetic knowledge of futures yet to unfold. "What do we do now, Pa?" Nathan asked. "We prepare ourselves for whatever's coming," Jeremiah said grimly. And if Ironhawk was right about Cole Blackwood heading this direction, he didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew Blackwood's reputation throughout the territory, the most feared outlaw in 3 states, a man who killed for pure pleasure and left calling cards carved into his victims' foreheads. If Ironhawk spoke truth about Blackwood's approach, they had precious little time to ready themselves for hell on earth. The Reed homestead sat like a lone island of human ambition in an endless ocean of grass and boundless sky built entirely by Jeremiah's own calloused hands after the war ended, and government promises of free land drew him west from Virginia's blood-soaked battlefields. The cabin was solidly constructed, thick logs, chinked with prairie mud and grass, a fieldstone chimney that drew smoke cleanly, real glass windows that had cost him 3 months' hard-earned wages. But solid construction didn't guarantee safety or security. Not with Cole Blackwood's gang terrorizing the territory like a biblical plague, hitting isolated homesteads with clockwork regularity and mathematical precision. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles south across empty grassland, and Marshal Thompson might as well have been stationed on the moon for all the practical protection he could provide to scattered frontier families. That evening, as purple shadows crept steadily across the grassland like fingers of approaching night, Jeremiah sat on his front porch, methodically cleaning weapons, while his children finished their simple supper inside the cabin. The domestic normalcy felt fragile now, brittle as thin ice over deep water. Every sound from the darkness beyond his property line could herald approaching death riding hard under cover of night. "Papa." Evangeline appeared in the doorway, her face scrubbed clean and her dark hair braided neatly for bed. "Is Ironhawk going to die from those terrible wounds?" "I don't know, sweetheart." He pulled her gently onto his lap, inhaling the clean scent of soap and childhood innocence that might not survive much longer in this harsh land. "But that's not our concern anymore. He was hurt so badly, though, Papa. All that blood everywhere. Men like that are tough as old boot leather," Nathan said, joining them on the porch with his own rifle cradled carefully in his arms. "He'll probably be raiding settlements again before the week's finished." "Nathan." Jeremiah's voice carried clear warning. "Mind your tongue around your sister." "Why should I? It's the plain truth, isn't it? Indians raid and kill, we defend ourselves and fight back." That's just the natural order of things out here in the territories. That man didn't try to hurt us at all. Evangeline protested with the moral certainty that only children possess in their innocence. He just wanted water to keep from dying of thirst. This time, maybe. Nathan countered with brutal adolescent logic. But what about next time when he's not half dead and outnumbered by our guns? Jeremiah carefully weighed his son's words, recognizing their harsh wisdom. The boy had valid points. Frontier survival demanded constant vigilance, and trust was a luxury no homesteading family could afford to indulge. Yet something about Ironhawk's bearing and manner suggested depths that simple racial prejudice couldn't adequately explain or dismiss. Your brother raises some valid concerns that we can't ignore, he admitted reluctantly. We simply can't afford to trust anyone completely out here, no matter how harmless they might appear. But Ironhawk said we were protected now. Evangeline insisted with touching faith. Because I gave him sacred water from the sacred spring. What could he have meant by that? Nothing but Indian superstition and nonsense, sweetheart. But even as he spoke those dismissive words, Jeremiah felt that familiar chill crawling up his spine like icy fingers. Ironhawk's dark eyes had held prophetic certainty, as if he'd somehow glimpsed specific futures that were yet to unfold in blood and fire. Time for bed now, he said, lifting Evangeline gently to her feet. Both of you need rest. Tomorrow we start strengthening our defenses and preparing for trouble. As his children disappeared into the cabin's warmth and lamplight, Jeremiah remained alone on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions under a star-crowded sky, beautiful and terrible in its vast emptiness. Somewhere out there in that darkness, Ironhawk was either recovering from his wounds or dying slowly and alone. And somewhere else, in that same darkness, Cole Blackwood rode steadily northward, with death and destruction following in his wake. A coyote's howl drifted across the night air, wild and lonely. Other voices answered from different compass points until the darkness filled with their primitive chorus. Jeremiah pulled his coat tighter and tried not to think about how remarkably similar the sound was to Cheyenne war cries echoing across a battlefield. Word traveled with terrifying speed across the frontier, carried by desperate riders and blood-soaked rumors that grew more horrific with each telling. By noon the next day, 3 neighbors had ridden hard to the Reed homestead, and their faces grim with accusation, and their hands resting ready on the butts of their weapons. Tom Bradley owned the spread to the south, normally a decent, God-fearing man with a devoted wife and 2 young sons who'd always been neighborly enough to help with barn raisings and harvest work. But the man dismounting at Jeremiah's porch bore little resemblance to that friendly homesteader. His weathered face was flushed with righteous anger, his entire posture radiating barely controlled violence and betrayal. "Jerry," he said without preamble or pleasantries, "we need to have some serious words about what happened here yesterday." Behind him, Sam Carson and Pete Matthews nodded their grim agreement like hanging judges. Carson ran cattle on the eastern grasslands, a surly bachelor who'd never been particularly friendly, but had never shown open hostility either. Matthews had earned his local reputation for seeing Indian threats lurking behind every shadow and tree stump, his paranoia legendary throughout the territory, but occasionally proving uncomfortably accurate. Jeremiah stepped down from the porch, keeping his movements casual and non-threatening, despite the obvious tension crackling in the air. "What brings you boys out this fine afternoon? You know damn well what brings us here." Carson spat brown tobacco juice, hitting the dust at his feet. "Word's already spread clear to the county seat that you harbored that butcher Ironhawk yesterday morning. Gave him aid and comfort like he was some kind of honored guest at your table. Evangeline gave water to a dying man." Jeremiah said carefully, choosing each word with diplomatic precision. "Nothing more than basic Christian charity, the kind any decent person would show. Christian charity. Matthew's voice rose to an outraged shout that sent prairie dogs scurrying for their burrows. Jerry, that was Ironhawk himself, the same bloodthirsty savage who led the massacre at Henderson's place yesterday morning. 7 dead, including the baby. And you're calling it Christian charity. You don't know that for absolute certain, Pete. Why the hell I don't know it. Matthews pulled a crumpled wanted poster from his coat pocket and thrust it aggressively at Jeremiah's face. Marshal Thompson's been circulating these all over the territory for months. $500 reward for that red devil, dead or alive? That's more hard money than most of us see in 2 full years. Jeremiah studied the crude sketch with growing unease, a generic Native American face that could have belonged to any of 1,000 men across the plains. The artist had clearly never laid eyes on Ironhawk in person, relying instead on second-hand descriptions and common racial stereotypes to create his wanted poster. "This drawing doesn't look like anybody in particular," he said finally. "Could be any Indian warrior from here to California. It looks close enough to matter for our purposes." Bradley said heavily, his voice weighted with disappointment and something approaching betrayal. "Jerry, I honestly thought you had better sense than this foolishness. We're all trying to build something worthwhile and lasting out here, but we simply cannot accomplish anything meaningful with knives constantly at our backs and tomahawks hanging over our heads." The man was dying in agony, Tom. "My daughter showed basic human decency to another suffering creature. I will not apologize for that action, and I certainly won't punish her for having a compassionate heart." Human decency. Carson laughed bitterly, the sound completely devoid of any humor or warmth. Where exactly was Ironhawk's human decency when he butchered the entire Williamson family 2 weeks ago, 3 innocent children, Jerry, including a baby girl barely old enough to walk? Where was his Christian mercy then? The cabin door creaked open on its leather hinges, and Nathan stepped onto the porch with his rifle clutched in steady hands and pure defiance written across his young features. He had obviously been listening to every word from inside, and his entire posture radiated barely contained anger at these men who dared threaten his family. "Maybe those people got exactly what they deserved," he said with the thoughtless cruelty that only adolescence can produce. "Maybe they were stealing Indian land just like everybody else out here, and maybe the Indians were just taking back what belonged to them in the first place." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Carson's weathered hand moved instinctively toward his gun, and for one heart-stopping moment, Jeremiah thought deadly violence might explode right there in his own front yard. "Nathan," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute paternal authority despite the dangerous circumstances. "Go back inside the cabin, immediately." "No, Papa. These men don't have any right to come here and threaten our family just because. Inside, right now, before you say something that gets us all killed where we stand." Nathan hesitated for several tense seconds, clearly torn between filial obedience and his burning desire to defend his family's honor against these accusers. Finally, he retreated into the cabin, but not before shooting the 3 visitors a look of pure contempt that made their hands edge closer to their weapons. "Jerry," Bradley said sadly, shaking his grizzled head like a disappointed father confronting a wayward son, "you're raising that boy to be an Indian lover. Out here in this territory, that's exactly the same as raising him to be dead before his time. I'm raising him to think for himself and make his own moral choices." Jeremiah replied stiffly. "Same way I raised his sister, same way my late wife would have wanted." "Well, your daughter's independent thinking nearly got your entire family massacred yesterday," Matthews said with brutal directness. "And it still might if you don't start showing some practical sense about the realities of frontier life." "What exactly are you 3 suggesting I should do?" The 3 men exchanged meaningful glances, their decision obviously reached through prior discussion, before riding out to confront him. Finally, Bradley stepped forward, his expression pained, but absolutely resolute in its determination. "Pack up your family and leave this place, Jerry. Tonight, before word spreads any further through the Indian camps about white folks who'll provide aid and comfort to wounded warriors. This is my land, Tom. I've got the deed, the surveys, all the legal papers. Everything is completely legitimate and proper. Non-legal papers don't matter much when you're lying dead with your scalp missing," Carson said with flat, merciless certainty. "And neither do we matter if Indians throughout the territory start thinking we're all soft-hearted fools who'll nurse their wounded back to fighting strength. And if I refuse to abandon everything I've worked 4 years to build, another long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them, like a taut rope ready to snap. Finally, Matthews spoke with the cold certainty of a man delivering an absolute ultimatum. "Then you're completely on your own from this moment forward, Jerry. No help with harvests, no shared watch duties, no community cooperation or support of any kind whatsoever. As far as every decent family in this territory is concerned, you'll be just another Indian lover who brought his inevitable fate down on his own stubborn head." "Tom." Jeremiah looked directly at Bradley, desperately hoping to find some trace of their former friendship still flickering in the man's weathered features. Bradley's face was etched with genuine regret, but his voice remained firm and absolutely unyielding. "I'm truly sorry, Jerry. Sorrier than you'll ever know or understand. But I've got my own wife and children to think about and protect, and their safety comes before everything else in this world." The 3 men mounted their horses with grim efficiency and rode away without another word or backward glance, leaving Jeremiah alone with the crushing knowledge that yesterday's single act of mercy had just cost him everything he had worked to build over 4 long, difficult years. That night, he called an urgent family meeting around their kitchen table, the oil lamp casting dancing shadows on faces tight with worry and confusion. The cabin felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were somehow closing in under the oppressive weight of their neighbors' rejection and the looming threat of complete social isolation. Nathan sat rigid with barely controlled fury, his adolescent hands clenched into fists on the rough wooden surface. Evangeline picked nervously at a loose thread on her dress, her young face troubled by emotions far too complex for her years to fully understand or articulate. "Now we need to discuss what's happening to our family," Jeremiah began carefully, "and what it might mean for our future here in this territory." "Those men were completely wrong, Papa," Evangeline said quietly, but with absolute moral conviction. "Ironhawk wasn't evil like they said he was. I could see real goodness in his eyes when he looked at me. Sometimes people aren't what they appear to be on the surface, sweetheart. And sometimes being genuinely good or bad matters less in this world than what other people choose to believe about you. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my entire life," Nathan said with passionate adolescent outrage. "If we did the morally right thing, why should we care what a bunch of cowards and hypocrites think about us? Because we don't live in complete isolation out here, son. We depend on our neighbors for help when times get truly hard, for protection, when serious trouble comes calling for the basic community cooperation that makes any kind of civilization possible on the frontier. Without that community support..." Jeremiah let the ominous sentence hang unfinished in the air. "So we should have let that man die horribly in agony just to keep our neighbors happy with us." Evangeline's voice was small but determined, carrying a moral authority that made her father's heart ache with pride and fear in equal measure. "I honestly don't know anymore, sweetheart. I truly don't know what the right answer is supposed to be." Nathan slammed his palm down on the table, hard enough to make the lamp chimney rattle dangerously. "This is completely insane. We save a human being's life through simple decency, and now we're the ones being punished for basic Christian behavior. Life isn't fair, Nathan. The sooner you accept that harsh reality, the better equipped you'll be to survive in this unforgiving world." "Well, maybe life should be fair. Nathan's voice cracked with passionate intensity that reminded Jeremiah painfully of his late wife. And if it's not naturally fair, then maybe somebody with courage ought to do something to make it fair. Jeremiah studied his son's face carefully, seeing so much of Martha in the boy's fierce moral certainty and complete unwillingness to compromise his principles, even when cold pragmatism demanded flexibility and accommodation. It had been one of the qualities he had loved most desperately about his wife, and one of the character traits that worried him most about Nathan's chances for survival. "Your mother used to say things exactly like that," he said softly, his voice thick with old grief that never quite healed. "About justice and fairness and the moral obligation to make the world better for everyone." "Mama was absolutely right," Evangeline said with simple, unshakable faith. "The world should be fair and just to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin." "Maybe so, sweetheart. But wanting something desperately and actually achieving it are two completely different things in this life." Jeremiah pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening prairie, where danger might even now be approaching under cover of darkness. The immediate question facing us is what we do next. We stay right here and fight for what's ours. Nathan said immediately, his young voice ringing with determination and barely controlled anger. "This is our home, our land. We built it with our own hands and our own sweat. We earned it through 4 years of backbreaking work, and nobody has the moral right to drive us away from it. Even if staying here means putting your little sister in mortal danger." Nathan's absolute certainty wavered slightly as he looked across the table at Evangeline's worried face. "She's not really in danger, though, is she? Ironhawk said we were protected now, remember, because of what she did for him when he was dying. And you're willing to bet your sister's life on the word of a Cheyenne war chief you'd never met before yesterday." "I'm willing to bet on her," Nathan said, looking at Evangeline with something approaching reverence. She saw something genuinely good and decent in that man, when everybody else could only see an enemy to fear and hate. Maybe that kind of moral insight is worth something important in this world. Jeremiah wanted desperately to argue to explain the harsh realities of frontier politics and racial hatred that his children were still too young and innocent to fully comprehend. But looking at their faces, Nathan's fierce determination burning bright as forge fire, Evangeline's quiet compassion glowing steady as candlelight, he found himself remembering exactly why he had brought them west in the first place. Not merely for land or economic opportunity, but for the chance to build something genuinely better than what they had left behind in war-torn Virginia. "All right, then," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and desperate hope in equal measure. "We stay and make our stand here. But if serious trouble comes, real immediate life-threatening danger, I want both of you to promise me you'll do exactly what I say, without argument, debate, or hesitation. No heroics, no moral grandstanding, just absolute obedience to my orders. Can you both give me that solemn promise?" "Yes, Papa," Evangeline said immediately, her trust in him complete and unquestioning. Nathan took considerably longer to answer, clearly struggling with his fiercely independent nature and adolescent pride. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. You have my word of honor." "Good enough." Jeremiah returned to the table and pulled his children close against him, one under each protective arm, breathing in their warmth and innocence, like a man taking his last taste of clean air. "Now, let's all pray to God Almighty that we never have to test those promises in blood and fire." Outside their small circle of lamplight and family warmth, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild voices carrying across the prairie like harbingers of the violence that was already riding toward them. Through the darkness, death mounted on horseback and closing the distance with every passing hour. 4 long days passed in deceptive tranquility that felt more ominous than reassuring. Jeremiah worked steadily on fence repairs, while Nathan helped manage their small herd of cattle, and Evangeline tended her vegetable garden behind the house. No neighbors stopped by to visit or share news, and no smoke signals appeared on the distant ridgelines. It was almost possible to believe that life might gradually return to some semblance of normalcy and peace. Then Cole Blackwood's gang struck the Morrison homestead with savage precision. News of the brutal attack reached them through Billy Hutchins, a 13-year-old boy who had ridden 30 miles on a half-dead horse to spread word of the massacre. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, his young face streaked with tears and trail dust, and his voice shook with trauma as he gasped out his terrible story between gulps of water that Evangeline provided with trembling hands. They came just before dawn. He managed his words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. Maybe 20 of them, all heavily armed and riding like demons straight from the depths of hell itself. Pa tried to organize some kind of defense, but they cut him down with rifle fire before he could even reach his weapon. "What about your mother and sisters?" Jeremiah asked as gently as possible, though he already dreaded the answer that was coming. "Ma managed to hide us younger ones in the root cellar when she heard the first gunshots echoing across the yard. We stayed down there in the darkness all day, and most of the night too terrified to move or even breathe loudly. When we finally crawled out to see what had happened," Billy's voice broke entirely, and for several long moments he could only sob helplessly into his hands. "Take all the time you need, son," Jeremiah said softly, placing a comforting hand on the boy's trembling shoulder. "They had taken absolutely everything we owned." Billy finally continued through his tears. "Every head of cattle, every horse in the corral, all our food stores and winter supplies. Even Ma's wedding ring, and Pa's watched the bastards strip the bodies of everything that might be worth a few dollars. Where's your family now? Are they safe? The Kowalskis took us in, God bless their generous hearts. But Mr. Kowalski says Blackwood's gang is working their way systematically north through the territory, hitting every isolated homestead they can find, like some kind of plague. He thinks—" Billy swallowed hard, his young face pale with terror. "He thinks your place might be next on their list, Mr. Reed." Nathan stepped forward immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. "How many guns are we talking about here? What kind of force—" Nathan, Jeremiah warned sharply. "I'm not being reckless, Pa. I just want to know exactly what we're up against if they decide to come calling here." "Too many," Billy said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Way too many for any single family to fight off successfully. And they're not like regular bandits who just want to rob you blind and move on to easier targets. These men are stone killers, pure and simple. They burn everything they can't steal, murder anyone who shows the slightest resistance, and leave messages carved into trees to terrorize the next family they plan to visit." "What kind of messages?" Evangeline asked, though something in Billy's expression suggested she might not want to know the answer. "Nagerkerhalkte, the Blackwood gang was here. Run or die next time. And they sign it with crude drawings of skulls and crossbones, just to make absolutely sure everyone understands exactly what they're promising to deliver." Jeremiah felt ice crystallizing in his stomach as the full implications sank in. Cole Blackwood was far more than just another outlaw gang leader operating in frontier territory. He was a force of pure malevolence and organized evil, as ruthless and unpredictable as a prairie wildfire burning out of control. According to territorial authorities who had been tracking him for months, the man had personally killed over 40 people during his 6-year reign of terror. And no law enforcement agency seemed capable of stopping him or even slowing him down significantly. "Billy," he said as calmly as possible under the circumstances, "did anyone see which direction they were heading when they finally left your family's place, northeast toward the Sanderson Ranch? But that was 2 full days ago. They could be anywhere by now, moving fast and covering ground." If Blackwood was indeed working systematically northward through the scattered homesteads, as Billy suggested, That put the Reed family directly in the gang's probable path of destruction. Depending on how many stops the killers made along their route and how much time they spent at each location, they had perhaps 3 or 4 days before the murderers reached their isolated corner of the territory. "You need to keep moving as fast as your horse can carry you, son," Jeremiah said with gentle urgency. "Make sure everyone in the area knows what's coming their way so they can prepare or flee as they see fit." Billy nodded wearily and remounted his exhausted horse with obvious effort. As he rode away toward the next homestead to continue spreading his warning, Jeremiah turned to find Nathan and Evangeline watching him with expectant, frightened faces that broke his heart. "What do we do now, Papa?" Evangeline asked in a voice so small it was barely audible. "We prepare for war, sweetheart," he said grimly, "and we pray for a miracle that might not come." But even as he spoke those words with false confidence, Jeremiah knew with sick certainty that prayer alone wouldn't be nearly enough to stop Cole Blackwood and his army of professional murderers. Nothing short of divine intervention could save his family now. They spent the next day and night transforming their peaceful homestead into a fortress designed for siege warfare. Jeremiah moved all their food supplies, ammunition, and medical provisions into the cabin's main room, while Nathan reinforced the windows with thick wooden shutters that could withstand rifle fire and concentrated arrow fire. Evangeline helped where her small hands were useful, though her father tried desperately to shield her from the worst implications of their frantic preparations for what might be their final stand. "If they come here," Jeremiah explained to his children as they worked through the second sleepless night by flickering lamplight, "they'll probably try to smoke us out by setting fire to the roof or walls. We need to be ready to fight the flames from inside while simultaneously keeping them from breaking down our defenses. What if there are just too many of them for us to handle?" Nathan asked with the brutal honesty that only youth could muster. "Then we make them pay as dearly as possible for whatever they take from us." Jeremiah replied, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing weather rather than their potential deaths. "Sometimes that's all you can do in a situation like this. Make the cost so prohibitively high that they think twice before hitting the next innocent family down the line." "Papa," Evangeline's voice was small and frightened, but remarkably steady, "are we really going to die?" "Not if I can help it, sweetheart. But I need you to be brave for me, just like you were with Iron Hawk when he was dying by our well." "Can you do that one more time?" "I'll try my very best, Papa. That's all anyone can ask for in this life." On the third night of their desperate preparations, Jeremiah maintained solitary watch from the front porch, while his exhausted children slept fitfully inside the fortified cabin. Every shadow on the moonlit prairie might conceal approaching riders, every sound might herald the beginning of their final battle for survival. Around midnight, he heard the unmistakable sound of the multiple horses moving with deliberate stealth through the darkness. At least 6 or 7 riders, maybe more, approaching from the eastern ridge with obvious hostile intent. His blood turned to ice water as he crept inside and shook Nathan awake, pressing a fully loaded rifle into the boy's trembling hands with practiced efficiency. "Oh, they're coming," he whispered with deadly urgency. "Remember everything we've practiced and rehearsed." Nathan nodded grimly, his young face pale but determined in the lamplight. Together, father and son took their carefully planned defensive positions at the front windows, while Evangeline hid behind the overturned kitchen table exactly as they had rehearsed dozens of times. The riders crested the small rise that bordered their property, and Jeremiah felt his heart nearly stop as he recognized the distinctive silhouettes moving against the star-filled sky. These weren't Cole Blackwood's murderous outlaws at all. They were Cheyenne warriors, at least a dozen of them moving like ghosts through the moonlit landscape with supernatural grace and silence. At their head rode Iron Hawk himself, looking completely recovered from his terrible wounds and radiating the quiet, deadly authority of a born war leader who had never known defeat. "Papa," Evangeline whispered from her hiding place. Is that really Ironhawk out there? Yes, it is. Jeremiah replied softly, not lowering his rifle despite the obvious lack of immediate threat. But I have absolutely no idea why he's here or what he wants from us. The warriors formed their traditional circle around the cabin with mathematical precision, just as they had 5 days earlier when Ironhawk lay dying. But this time, their weapons were prominently displayed for intimidation, and their faces were painted for serious warfare rather than mere ceremony or ritual. Ironhawk dismounted with fluid grace and approached the front door, his movements confident and purposeful as a stalking predator. Reed family. He called out in clear, unaccented English that surprised Jeremiah with its perfect pronunciation. I would speak with you about matters of life and death that concern us all. We can hear you just fine from inside here. Jeremiah replied through the securely barred door. The child, the little water giver, is she safe and well? She's perfectly safe. What exactly do you want from us tonight? To warn you of approaching danger that rides toward you even as we speak. Evil men come from the south with many guns and hearts full of darkness. They kill for pleasure and profit, not need or survival. Jeremiah exchanged meaningful glances with Nathan, both of them thinking immediately of Billy Hutchins's terrifying account of the Morrison massacre. We know about Cole Blackwood's gang. We're as ready for them as we can possibly be. Ironhawk's laugh was bitter and completely without humor, like wind across ancient burial grounds. You are not ready for men like these, White Father. No one can be truly ready for creatures whose spirits are diseased with pure evil, whose souls have been poisoned beyond any hope of redemption. Then why are you here tonight? To watch us die for your entertainment? To repay the sacred debt I owe to the little water giver? Ironhawk said with simple dignity that carried across the darkness like a bell. Your daughter showed mercy and kindness when she had no reason to trust, no obligation to help. Now I offer protection and alliance when I have no duty to interfere in white man's troubles. I still don't understand what you're proposing. These bad men who ride toward you, they burn sacred places without thought, murder women and children and old ones without conscience, destroy everything they touch like a plague of locusts. They are enemies to all decent people, white and Cheyenne alike. Tonight we fight together against common evil that threatens us both. The proposition was so completely unexpected that Jeremiah found himself speechless for several long moments. Nathan stepped closer to the window, peering out at the warriors who surrounded their home like protective spirits from another world. How do we know this isn't some kind of elaborate trap? The boy asked with surprising maturity and wisdom. Ironhawk heard the question clearly and nodded with obvious approval. Smart boy asks the right question. You want proof of my sincere intentions. He gestured dramatically toward the eastern horizon, where distant campfires flickered like fallen stars against the black sky. Look there and count the fires if you can. Jeremiah followed his pointing finger and felt his blood freeze solid in his veins. At least 30 separate fires dotted the landscape in an organized pattern scattered across several miles of prairie in formations that suggested a large, well-disciplined force moving steadily northward through the night. Blackwood comes with the dawn. Ironhawk continued with prophetic certainty. Maybe 40 men, all killers without honor or conscience. You have 2 rifles and brave hearts willing to fight. Not nearly enough to survive what's coming. And what exactly do you want in return for your help? Nothing at all. When this night ends in blood and fire, the debt between our families will be settled completely and forever. After that, you will be simply another white family living on land that once belonged to my people. Ironhawk paused meaningfully, then added with something approaching warmth. But perhaps some debts are worth far more than simple repayment. What do you mean by that? Your child showed me that kindness can exist between natural enemies, that mercy can bridge the deepest divisions between peoples who have every reason to hate each other. Perhaps tonight we prove that courage and honor can unite former foes against evil that threatens us all. Evangeline's clear voice drifted from behind the table where she crouched in hiding. "Papa, please let them help us. I trust Ironhawk with my whole heart." Jeremiah stared hard at the Cheyenne chief for a long, tense moment, weighing years of ingrained prejudice and frontier survival instinct against the evidence of his own eyes and the desperate needs of his family. Everything in his lifetime of experience screamed not to trust these warriors, not to believe their promises of protection and alliance. But everything in his father's heart whispered that Ironhawk was offering their only realistic hope of survival. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was agreeing to. "What do you need us to do?" Ironhawk smiled broadly, the first genuinely warm and human expression Jeremiah had ever seen on the man's weathered, paint-streaked features. "Open your door, White Father. We plan together, fight together, trust together like true allies and brothers in arms." Jeremiah unbarred the heavy wooden door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle still ready in his hands, but no longer aimed at potential enemies. Ironhawk studied his face intently for several heartbeats, reading character and resolve in the lines around his eyes, then nodded with obvious satisfaction. "Good," the chief said simply. "Now we prepare for war." The alliance that formed in the Reed family's modest kitchen that night defied every convention of frontier warfare and racial hatred. Ironhawk's tactical knowledge was both sophisticated and ruthlessly practical. His understanding of Cole Blackwood's methods disturbingly thorough and precise. As they planned their desperate defense around the scarred wooden table, Jeremiah found himself grudgingly impressed by the chief's strategic brilliance and attention to detail. Blackwood always follows the same pattern of attack. Ironhawk explained patiently sketching crude battle plans with charcoal on precious paper. Fast assault from multiple directions, overwhelming firepower to break resistance quickly, absolutely no mercy for anyone who dares to fight back. He depends entirely on terror and surprise to paralyze his victims. "How do you know so much about his specific tactics and methods?" Nathan asked with obvious fascination. "We have watched him and his men for many months, now studied his movements, like hunters study dangerous prey." Ironhawk's voice carried deep, personal hatred that made the words burn with intensity. 4 months ago, he slaughtered an entire family of my people who were traveling to visit relatives. Grandmother, mother, 2 small children, barely old enough to walk. Left their bodies scattered for scavengers and buzzards to feast upon. Then why haven't you done something about him before now? White man's law strictly forbids us to hunt white killers, no matter how evil their crimes. Ironhawk replied with bitter irony. If we attack Blackwood openly, cavalry soldiers come immediately to punish us for unprovoked massacre of innocent white men. But tonight, the chief's smile was sharp and predatory as a scalping knife. Tonight, we defend white family from white murderers. Even your government cannot object to that. The strategy they developed together was elegantly simple in its conception, but deadly in its potential execution. Ironhawk's warriors would position themselves in carefully chosen hiding spots around the homestead, allowing Blackwood's gang to approach the cabin without detecting the presence of the ambush. When the outlaws fully committed themselves to their assault, the Cheyenne would strike simultaneously from multiple directions, catching the gang in a devastating crossfire. "What about us?" Jeremiah asked practically. "What's our specific role in this battle plan?" "You and your family are the bait that draws them into our trap," Ironhawk said with brutal honesty. "Act frightened and desperate, convince them you are alone and helpless. Draw them as close to the cabin as possible, keep their attention focused entirely on the front entrance." "You're asking us to trust you completely with our lives." "Yes, exactly. The same absolute trust your daughter showed when she gave life-giving water to a dying enemy who had every reason to kill her." Evangeline spoke up clearly from her position beside the table, her young voice steady despite the circumstances. I trust him completely, Papa, with everything I am. Sweetheart, this is different from what happened before. This is actual warfare. No. Ironhawk corrected gently but firmly. This is justice in its purest form. War happens when good people fight each other for bad reasons they don't fully understand. Justice happens when good people unite against genuine evil for reasons that are absolutely clear. Nathan leaned forward eagerly across the table, his adolescent blood stirring at the prospect of real combat and glory. Can I fight alongside your warriors? I'm an excellent marksman with both rifle and pistol. You fight beside your father where you belong, Ironhawk said with paternal firmness. Protect your sister, protect your family home. That is true warrior's work, just as important and honorable as any cavalry charge. As the first pale light of dawn began creeping across the eastern horizon, the Cheyenne warriors melted into the surrounding landscape like morning mist touched by sunlight. Jeremiah watched them disappear with professional admiration. Within mere minutes, it became completely impossible to detect that 10 heavily armed and painted men were hidden within 50 yards of his cabin, ready to unleash death on command. Papa, Evangeline whispered as they took their final defensive positions according to the carefully rehearsed plan. Are you really scared about what's going to happen? More terrified than I've ever been in my entire life. He admitted with complete honesty. But sometimes being properly scared keeps you thinking clearly and reacting quickly when clear thinking and quick reactions mean the difference between living and dying. Will Ironhawk really help us when the fighting starts? I believe so with all my heart, sweetheart. I think he's a man who keeps his sacred promises no matter what the personal cost might be. I'm so glad he's our friend now instead of our enemy. The eastern horizon began lightening steadily, painting the endless prairie in delicate shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Somewhere in that deceptively peaceful landscape, Cole Blackwood and his army of professional killers were riding steadily toward them, bringing death and destruction in their murderous wake. But for the first time since this terrible ordeal had begun, Jeremiah felt something genuinely approaching hope stirring deep in his chest. Whatever happened in the next few hours of blood and fire, his beloved family wouldn't have to face it completely alone. They came with the rising sun like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse themselves, riding hard out of the brilliant morning light with weapons gleaming like silver fire and pure murder burning in their soulless eyes. Jeremiah counted 26 men in total, all heavily armed with the latest weapons and radiating the casual professional brutality that marked them as career killers who had long ago abandoned any pretense of human decency. At their head rode Cole Blackwood himself, a tall, unnaturally lean figure with pale, colorless eyes that seemed to hold no warmth or recognizable human emotion whatsoever. His face was sharp-featured and predatory, like a hunting hawk bred specifically for killing, and when he smiled, it was with the cold satisfaction of a man who genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering. Reed family. Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the prairie morning as his gang spread out with military precision to surround the cabin in an inescapable net. I know you're all cowering in there like rabbits hiding in their burrow. Come out peacefully, and let's discuss some reasonable terms for ending this situation. Jeremiah positioned himself carefully at the front window, his rifle loaded and ready, but kept deliberately out of sight as Ironhawk had instructed. What kind of terms are you offering, Blackwood? The most generous terms you're likely to hear today. The outlaw leader called back with mocking cheerfulness. You hand over everything you own, cattle, horses, food stores, money, weapons, anything of value. And in exchange, we promise to kill you quickly, instead of slowly. How's that for Christian charity and fair dealing? Jeremiah felt Nathan tense beside him and the boy's rifle starting to rise toward the window, but he caught his son's arm in a grip of iron. Not yet, he whispered urgently. Let Ironhawk choose the exact moment for maximum effect. And what happens if we refuse your generous offer? Jeremiah called back, playing his role as frightened homesteader to perfection. Blackwood's laughter was like breaking glass, mixed with the sound of nails dragging across slate. Then we roast you alive in your little fortress. But we'll take our sweet time about it. Maybe have ourselves some recreational entertainment with that pretty young daughter of yours before we finish the job properly. The threat against Evangeline sent rage surging through Jeremiah's veins like liquid fire. But he forced himself to remain calm and focused on the plan. Outside, he could see Blackwood's men dismounting with practiced efficiency, some gathering dry grass and deadwood for their fires, while others positioned themselves for the coordinated assault they had obviously performed many times before. Reed. Blackwood called again, his voice dripping with mock patience and barely contained anticipation. You've got exactly 60 seconds to open that door and start cooperating like a reasonable man. After that, we do this the hard way, and I promise you won't enjoy the experience. Go straight to hell, you murdering bastard. Oh, wrong answer, neighbor. The outlaw leader raised his gloved hand in a prearranged signal, and his men began their methodical preparations for siege warfare. Boys, it looks like we're doing this the entertaining way. After all, Jenkins, you and Murphy start building us a nice bonfire. Carter, check that barn for anything useful we can appropriate. The rest of you worthless dogs keep those windows covered so our rabbits can't bolt for freedom. As the gang spread out to begin their assault with terrifying professional competence, Jeremiah caught the faintest glimpse of movement in the tall grass beyond the barn. Just a shadow barely visible, even to eyes that knew exactly what to look for. But enough to confirm that Ironhawk's warriors were in position and ready to unleash death. Now we wait, he told his children softly, and trust completely in our unlikely allies. The outlaws moved with the terrifying efficiency of men who had performed this exact same ritual of terror dozens of times before. Some gathered fuel for fires, while others checked their weapons and positioned themselves for maximum tactical advantage. Blackwood himself remained mounted on his magnificent black stallion, directing the operation with the casual competence of a veteran predator who had never known defeat. Papa, Evangeline whispered from her hiding place behind the overturned table. Why do these men want to hurt us so badly? We've never done anything to them or even met them before. Because they've chosen to become Monster's sweetheart. Jeremiah replied softly, his voice heavy with sadness for the corruption of human souls. Some people deliberately choose evil over good, darkness over light, and these men made that choice long ago. A rifle shot cracked sharply across the morning air, like a whip followed immediately by a scream of pain and surprise. One of the outlaws near the barn staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as bright red blood seeped steadily between his fingers. For a moment of perfect crystalline confusion, the entire gang froze in shock and disbelief. Indians! Tom Jenkins shouted in terror, his voice cracking with panic. Jesus Christ, we're surrounded by goddamn savages. The peaceful prairie exploded into deadly chaos as Ironhawk's warriors emerged from their concealment like avenging spirits materialized from the earth itself, their traditional war cries splitting the morning air with primitive fury that chilled the blood. Arrows and rifle balls flew in all directions as the two forces clashed in savage close-quarters combat that showed no mercy to either side. Now! Jeremiah shouted to Nathan over the sounds of battle. Pick your targets carefully and make every shot count. Father and son began firing methodically at any outlaw who came within effective range, their shots adding to the general mayhem and confusion. Evangeline crouched behind her makeshift shelter as instructed, her small hands pressed tightly over her ears to block out the horrific sounds of men dying violently just outside their walls. The fighting was brutal and desperate, a life-or-death struggle with no quarter asked or given by either side. 5 outlaws went down in the first 90 seconds, victims of precisely placed arrows or rifle balls fired from close range by expert marksmen. But Blackwood's men were seasoned killers who had survived dozens of similar encounters through ruthless skill and utter lack of conscience, and they rallied quickly from their initial surprise. "Kill every last one of those red devils first." Blackwood roared over the gunfire, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Deal with the family after we finish these painted savages." The outlaw leader spurred his horse directly toward Ironhawk himself, drawing a massive Bowie knife that gleamed like silver lightning as he rode. The two men crashed together in a terrible tangle of violence and ancestral hatred, rolling across the blood-stained ground as they fought desperately for lethal advantage. Ironhawk. Evangeline cried out in alarm, starting to rise from her hiding place despite the bullets flying past the windows like deadly hail. "Stay down," Jeremiah ordered sharply, but his attention was dangerously divided between his daughter's safety and the epic life-or-death struggle raging just outside their walls. In that crucial moment of distraction, he failed to notice the outlaw who had been creeping stealthily along the cabin's western wall until it was almost too late to react. Glass exploded inward in a shower of razor-sharp fragments as the man smashed through the side window with his rifle butt, sending crystalline shards flying across the room like deadly snow. Nathan spun toward the new threat and fired instinctively, his shot taking the intruder's center mass and dropping him instantly. But the sound of breaking glass had alerted two more outlaws, who were already climbing through the shattered opening with murder in their eyes. Nathan. Jeremiah swung his rifle toward the new threats, his first shot downing one man cleanly, but missing the second entirely. The surviving outlaw dove behind the overturned table where Evangeline was hiding, using her small body as a human shield, while pressing his Colt revolver against her temple. "Well, well, well." The man sneered with savage glee, his scarred face twisted into a mask of cruel anticipation. "Looks like we just found ourselves some valuable insurance to guarantee good behavior." Everything stopped as if time itself had suddenly frozen solid. The sounds of battle outside seemed to fade into meaningless background noise, as Jeremiah stared at his daughter's terror-stricken face, with his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. The outlaw holding her was young, maybe 25, with cruel pale eyes and a jagged scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, the kind of mark left by someone who had barely survived previous knife fights. "Drop those rifles right now, nice and slow," the man ordered with obvious relish, "or this pretty little girl gets her brains splattered all over your nice clean walls like abstract art." Jeremiah's hands shook uncontrollably as he slowly began to lower his weapon, every paternal instinct screaming at him to fight, while his desperate love for his daughter demanded complete submission to save her life. Nathan hesitated with his rifle still trained on the outlaw's head, desperately searching for any possible shot that wouldn't endanger Evangeline. "Son," Jeremiah said quietly, his voice steady despite the impossible circumstances, "do exactly what he says." "Smart family, very smart indeed." The outlaw grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth that looked like old ivory. "Now kick those weapons away nice and gentle, and maybe we can work out some kind of—" But here came the twist that nobody could have anticipated. Tom Bradley burst through the front door with his rifle blazing, followed immediately by Sam Carson and Pete Matthews, the same neighbors who had rejected the Reed family just days before. But instead of joining Blackwood's assault, they opened fire on the outlaws with deadly precision. "Jerry," Bradley shouted over the gunfire, "we came as soon as we saw the smoke. We were wrong about everything." The outlaw holding Evangeline spun in confusion, and in that split second of distraction, a Cheyenne war arrow sprouted from his throat like a deadly flower. Ironhawk stepped through the broken window, his bow still in his hands, and grim satisfaction painted across his war-streaked features. "Little water giver," he said gently, helping Evangeline to her feet with infinite care. You are safe now. But the greatest surprise was yet to come. As the battle raged outside, Bradley grabbed Jeremiah's arm with desperate urgency. Jerry, there's something you need to know. He gasped between shots. Blackwood's been getting information about which homesteads to hit. Someone's been feeding him details about families' defenses when men are away from home. What are you saying, Tom? I'm saying we've got a traitor among us. Someone who's been working with Blackwood all along. Before Jeremiah could respond, Pete Matthews suddenly wheeled around with his rifle pointed not at the outlaws, but at Bradley's back. Sorry, Tom, he said with cold calculation. You weren't supposed to figure that out. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Matthews, paranoid, suspicious Pete Matthews, who saw Indian threats everywhere, had been Blackwood's inside man all along, feeding information about isolated families in exchange for a share of the loot and a promise to spare his own homestead. Now, you son of a bitch, Bradley snarled, raising his own weapon. How many families died because of your greed? Enough to make me rich. Matthews replied without a trace of remorse. And now you're going to join them. But Nathan had been listening from across the room, and his rifle spoke first. Matthews toppled backward with Nathan's bullet in his chest, his treachery ended by a 16-year-old boy who had learned the hard lessons of frontier justice. Outside, the battle was reaching its climax. Ironhawk and Cole Blackwood were locked in mortal combat atop the cabin's roof, both men teetering on the edge of a 20-foot drop, while flames from Blackwood's thrown torch began to spread across the wooden shingles below them. You think you can stop me, you red savage? Blackwood snarled, his knife slashing wildly at Ironhawk's throat. I do not think, Ironhawk replied with deadly calm. I know. The two warriors grappled desperately as fire spread beneath their feet and bullets flew around them like angry hornets. For a moment, it seemed that Blackwood might gain the upper hand through sheer, vicious determination. But Ironhawk's superior skill and righteous purpose finally told. With a move too quick to follow, the chief disarmed his opponent and sent him tumbling from the burning roof to crash into the stone well below. Cole Blackwood lay broken and dying beside the same well, where Evangeline had given water to Ironhawk just days before. But even in defeat, his eyes burned with unquenchable malice. This isn't over, he gasped with his last breath. Others will come. Others like me. I'll let them come, Ironhawk said, simply climbing down from the burning roof with blood streaming from multiple wounds. We will be ready. The cabin burned fiercely, consuming 4 years of hard work in a matter of hours. But the Reed family stood together, watching the flames, their faces blackened with soot, but their spirits unbroken. Around them, the surviving members of Blackwood's gang fled into the prairie, their reign of terror ended by the unlikely alliance between homesteaders and Cheyenne warriors. I'm sorry, Jerry. Tom Bradley said, his voice heavy with shame and gratitude. We were so wrong about everything. About you, about Ironhawk, about what really matters out here. Fear makes fools of good men sometimes, Jeremiah replied, echoing Ironhawk's earlier words. The important thing is that you came when we needed you most. Over the following weeks, something unprecedented took shape on the burned prairie. Ironhawk's warriors worked alongside white settlers to clear debris and construct a new cabin larger and more solidly built than the original. The sight of Cheyenne and homesteaders laboring side by side drew visitors from across the territory, all marveling at this extraordinary cooperation between peoples who had been enemies for generations. When they raised the roof beam of the new cabin, Ironhawk presented Evangeline with 2 gifts, the carved eagle she treasured and a silver bracelet that had belonged to his grandmother. Mo, for the little water giver, he said with formal ceremony. So that all may know, you are sister to the Cheyenne people, daughter of 2 worlds, bridge between hearts that were once filled with hate. And thank you, Evangeline said, tears streaming down her face. "Will you always be our friend?" "Always," Ironhawk promised. "And when I can no longer walk this earth, my spirit will watch over you and your children and their children, for kindness given freely can never truly die." But their happiness was shadowed by approaching change. Government officials had already announced new policies that would force all Indians onto reservations, ending the brief period of cooperation and mutual respect that had flourished around the Reed homestead. When the time came for Ironhawk's people to leave, the entire community gathered to see them off. The chief rode at the head of his band, proud and dignified, despite this crushing defeat. As they passed the Reed homestead, he raised his hand in final salute. "Remember the water giver," he called out. "Remember that mercy is stronger than hate." Years passed. The territory became a state. The railroad came through, and the town of Harmony grew up around the Reed homestead, named to honor the brief but transformative alliance that had changed so many hearts and minds. Jeremiah served as mayor, Nathan married and started his own ranch, and Evangeline became a teacher who made sure that every child learned the story of how kindness could triumph over hatred. When word came that Ironhawk had died peacefully on the reservation surrounded by children, he had taught to read and write in both English and Cheyenne, the entire town held a memorial service. Evangeline, now a young woman of 21, spoke about the power of simple human kindness to change the world. "Ironhawk taught me that heroes aren't always the people who win battles," she said, standing by the well where their friendship had begun. "Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who choose mercy when they could choose revenge, who build bridges when others build walls, who see the humanity in their enemies." She poured fresh water into her old tin cup and held it up to the sky. "This is for Ironhawk," she said. "My friend, my teacher, my reminder that love is always stronger than hate." As the water caught the last rays of the setting sun and fell to the earth in golden drops, a gentle breeze stirred the prairie grass, carrying with it the whispered promise that some bonds once forged in compassion and sealed with sacrifice could never be broken by time or distance or even death itself. Evangeline married Dr. James Morrison 5 years later, and their children grew up hearing the story of the water giver and the Cheyenne chief who had shown the world that enemies could become friends through the simple magic of human kindness. The carved eagle sat on their mantelpiece, and Ironhawk's grandmother's bracelet adorned Evangeline's wrist, reminders of a friendship that had changed everything. When Evangeline's own granddaughter asked about the bracelet many years later, the old woman smiled and told the story once more, how a frightened little girl had chosen compassion over fear, how that choice had rippled outward to transform an entire territory, and how the echo of that kindness continued to resonate through generations of children who learned that the world could indeed be made better, one cup of water at a time. The well still stood weathered but strong, its stones dark with age, but its water still sweet and cold. And sometimes, on quiet prairie evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass, travelers passing by would find a cup of fresh water waiting on the stone rim left there by someone who understood that mercy once given freely must be freely shared with all who thirst. The circle was complete, the story was finished, and the world was immeasurably better, because a small girl had once seen past fear to find the humanity that dwelt within us all.